Thomas Martinez adjusted the dim light in his study, letting it bathe the stack of legal briefs on his desk. The weight of another long day pressed on him. He had poured himself a glass of whiskey, savoring its slow burn as he leaned back in his chair. Laughter drifted through the walls. The kids must have been in the living room with Eleanor. He smiled faintly, imagining his daughters with sparring against her younger brother's dry humor. But the smile faded as their voices grew louder. "Honestly, Dad's so stupid and dumb," his daughter's voice carried, sharp and unfiltered. Thomas froze, the glass halting just short of his lips. "He doesn't know you're our real father," she continued, the words landing like blows. "Mom says once the inheritance comes through, we'll all move to your place in Europe. She's a genius." Thomas's grip on the glass tightened. His mind raced to process the venom behind those words. His son chimed in, his tone dripping with disdain. "Yeah, he still thinks we're his little kids. Mom says he's just a provider." A third voice joined them, a man's voice, deep and smooth, but with a condescending edge. "Enjoy it while it lasts. Soon, we'll be living the good life in my villa." Thomas clenched his jaw, forcing himself to breathe. He didn't dare move, not wanting to alert them to his presence. He tilted his head, straining to catch every word. His daughter laughed. "It's hilarious. He's working so hard, and he has no clue what's coming." The man chuckled. "That's why you play the long game, sweetheart. Your mom's done a great job keeping him in the dark." Thomas set the whiskey glass down carefully on the desk, though his hand trembled. His heart pounded, each beat echoing in his ears. "I can't wait to get out of this boring house," his son said. "Mom says we'll finally have everything we deserve." "Soon, kiddo," the man replied. "Just bide your time. The inheritance will seal the deal. Then we're out of here." The conversation shifted to lighter topics, jokes about school, a few insults about Thomas's habits. But he had heard enough. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the wall, as if he could see through it. The betrayal seeped in like a slow poison. Not just from Eleanor, but from the children he had raised, loved, and sacrificed for. But even in the storm of emotions, anger, disbelief, heartbreak, one thing crystallized. He couldn't let them win. With deliberate care, he rose from his chair and walked to the door of the study, opening it just wide enough to peek into the hallway. The living room light spilled into the corridor, and he could see their silhouettes. The man, mid-40s, with a neatly trimmed beard and casual confidence, sat with an arm draped over the back of the couch. His children sat on the floor, their expressions animated as they laughed at whatever he had just said. Eleanor wasn't in sight, but Thomas didn't doubt she was part of this scheme. He pulled back into the study, shutting the door softly. Thomas sat at his desk, staring at his phone. He thought about confronting them right then and there, tearing through the living room, demanding answers, and watching the smug grins crumble into panic. But no, that's what they'd expect from their stupid and dumb provider. Instead, he opened a secure folder on his computer. In it, a PDF file gleamed under the label. DNA test results. He clicked it open and read the familiar lines for what felt like the 100th time. Child 1, not a biological match. Child 2, not a biological match. It had been a painful suspicion, but he had acted on it weeks ago. And now, with the confirmation and tonight's revelation, there was no doubt left. Thomas leaned forward, his mind racing. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but a new clarity sharpened his thoughts. He didn't need to yell or demand explanations. He didn't need to fight them on their terms. No, he would dismantle their plans piece by piece. The next morning, Thomas maintained his routine. He greeted Eleanor in the kitchen with his usual calm demeanor. "You're up early," she said, smiling as she poured coffee into a mug. "Lots to do today," Thomas replied, sipping his own cup. "Big case coming up?" Eleanor nodded. "Good. You've been working so hard lately." She said it without a hint of guilt, but Thomas caught the flicker of calculation in her eyes. He nodded, hiding his contempt. The kids shuffled into the kitchen, barely sparing him a glance as they grabbed breakfast. "Morning, Dad," his son mumbled, not bothering to meet his eyes. Thomas smiled faintly. "Morning, champ. Big plans today?" Just hanging out with friends, his daughter answered casually, already texting on her phone. Eleanor gave them a knowing look, a silent exchange that didn't go unnoticed by Thomas. As they left, Thomas sat at the table, watching Eleanor move around the kitchen. She was as composed as ever, but he could see it now, the subtle distance she kept, the lack of genuine warmth. "I'll be home late," he said finally, setting down his mug. "Of course," she replied smoothly. "We'll manage." Thomas nodded, leaving the house without another word. That evening, as Thomas walked into the house, Eleanor greeted him with her usual charm. "Dinner's almost ready," she said. "Great," Thomas replied, hanging up his coat. "Smells good." The kids sat in the living room, engrossed in their phones. Thomas watched them for a moment, feeling a pang of sadness that quickly turned to resolve. He joined them briefly, asking about their day. They gave vague, dismissive answers, their attention barely shifting from their screens. Thomas smiled to himself. They had no idea what was coming. As the night wore on, Thomas retired to his study, pretending to work while the rest of the house quieted. But his mind wasn't on the files in front of him. Instead, he was thinking about the final steps he would take in the days to come, the steps that would leave Eleanor, her lover, and their arrogant schemes in ruins. Thomas Martinez woke up to the faint smell of freshly brewed coffee and the soft hum of Eleanor moving around in the kitchen. For a moment, he let himself believe that everything was normal, that they were still the happy couple from years ago. But as he rolled out of bed and glanced at the empty space beside him, the weight of doubt returned. Walking downstairs, he found Eleanor at the counter, scrolling on her phone. She looked up when he entered, her practiced smile appearing as if on cue. "Morning, Thomas. Coffee's ready." He poured himself a cup and leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. "You're up early. Had some things on my mind," she said, her tone light. "Oh, by the way, I'll need some extra money for the kids' school trip to Paris." Thomas took a sip, letting the warmth settle before responding. "Didn't I just give you money for that last week?" Eleanor didn't miss a beat. "There were some extra expenses," she said, brushing her hair back. "You know how these things go. Don't worry about it." He nodded slowly, setting the cup down. "Of course." Her smile lingered, but her eyes flicked back to her phone. Thomas turned and walked to the dining room, his mind already spinning. Later that day, Thomas sat in his office at the law firm, reviewing documents. His assistant, Claire, knocked lightly before stepping in. "Mr. Martinez, these just came in," she said, placing a stack of papers on his desk. "Thanks, Claire," he replied, barely looking up. She hesitated. "Everything all right? You seem a bit distracted lately." Thomas paused, looking at her for a moment. "I'm fine. Just a lot on my plate." Claire nodded, though her expression didn't quite believe him. Once she left, Thomas leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Eleanor's request for money wasn't unusual, but the frequency of her demands had increased over the past year. Coupled with the late-night phone calls she thought he didn't notice and her growing distance, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That evening, Thomas arrived home to find Eleanor in the living room with her son, Miles, and daughter, Maddie. The kids barely looked up as he entered. "Hey, Dad," Miles said, not bothering to pause his video game. "Hi, sweetheart," Maddie added, her eyes glued to her phone. "Dinner soon?" Thomas asked, loosening his tie. Eleanor looked up from the couch, her smile polite but distant. "Almost ready. How was your day?" "Busy," he said, sitting on the armrest of a chair. "How about you?" "Oh, the usual," she replied, waving her hand dismissively. Thomas nodded, observing the easy camaraderie between Eleanor and the kids. They laughed at inside jokes, their interactions fluid. He used to feel included in these moments, but now he felt like an outsider. As the conversation shifted, Eleanor's phone buzzed on the coffee table. She glanced at it quickly, her expression tightening for a fraction of a second before she picked it up and walked toward the kitchen. "I'll check on dinner," she said over her shoulder. Thomas watched her go, his suspicion growing. That night, Thomas lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Eleanor was asleep beside him, her breathing steady. He turned his head slightly, watching her in the dim light. The same woman he had loved for 2 decades. The same woman who now felt like a stranger. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the silence. It was an email notification, his bank's fraud detection team. He opened it, reading through the alert. Several transactions from their joint account stood out. Luxury shopping sprees, unexplained withdrawals, and an extravagant hotel booking he didn't recognize. He exhaled slowly, placing the phone back on the nightstand. The next day, Thomas decided to test the waters. Over breakfast, he set his mug down and casually said, "I was looking at the account last night. Noticed some unusual charges. Did you buy anything at Luxury Avenue last week?" Eleanor's hand paused mid-reach for her coffee, but her smile remained intact. "Oh yes, I picked up a few things for the kids. Maddie needed a new dress for her recital." Thomas replied, his tone neutral. "You know how teenagers are," she added, brushing it off. Thomas nodded, but inside his resolve hardened. He had given her an out, a chance to be honest. She had chosen to lie. That evening, Thomas went through the motions of family life. He helped Miles with homework, complimented Maddie on her latest art project, and even sat with Eleanor to watch a movie. But when everyone went to bed, Thomas stayed up, his laptop open. He started digging deeper into their finances, cross-referencing expenses with Eleanor's known activities. His findings painted a troubling picture. There were nights Eleanor had claimed to be with friends, but had booked a table for two at high-end restaurants. The hotel booking wasn't a one-time thing. It was part of a pattern. Thomas rubbed his temples, the pieces falling into place. Eleanor wasn't just lying. She was living a double life. The following weekend, Thomas decided to confront her indirectly. "Hey," he said casually as they sat on the patio. "We should plan a family trip this summer. Maybe Paris since the kids are already going. What do you think?" Eleanor's reaction was almost imperceptible, but Thomas caught it, the flicker of unease before she smiled. "That's a great idea. Let's talk about it later, though. I've got a lot on my plate right now." "Of course," he said, leaning back in his chair. As she turned to go inside, Thomas's eyes lingered on her. He didn't need to press further. He already had his answer. Over the next few weeks, Thomas started paying closer attention to Eleanor's behavior. He noted her comings and goings, her conversations with the kids, and the subtle shifts in her demeanor. One evening, he followed her as she left the house, claiming to meet a friend for dinner. He kept a safe distance, his car blending into traffic. She pulled into the parking lot of an upscale restaurant, stepping out in a dress he didn't recognize. Thomas parked across the street, watching as she greeted a man who was already waiting at the entrance. They exchanged a quick kiss before walking inside. Thomas sat there for a long moment, the reality of the situation sinking in. He didn't follow them inside. He didn't need to. Instead, he drove home, his mind racing. This wasn't just a crack in their marriage. It was a chasm, and it was about to swallow everything he thought he knew. The kids were laughing in the living room, their voices punctuated by sarcastic jabs at something on TV. Thomas sat in his study, the faint hum of their conversation seeping through the walls. He had thought their occasional sneers and Eleanor's growing coldness were just the byproducts of a strained family life. But after what he overheard that day, everything had changed. Hours earlier, he had been upstairs, passing by their open bedroom door when he caught a snippet of a conversation between Maddie and Miles. He paused, his hand still gripping the banister. "Honestly, Mom's so smart," Maddie said, her tone dripping with amusement. "She said we just have to hold out a little longer. Once the inheritance is ours, we're out of here." Miles chuckled. "Yeah, poor Dad doesn't even see it coming. She's got him completely fooled." Thomas's stomach tightened, his grip on the banister turning his knuckles white. He stayed frozen, every muscle locked in place. Maddie added, "She said the money will help us start fresh in Europe. You know, with him." "Him" was said with a mix of reverence and familiarity. Thomas didn't need to guess who they meant. Miles snickered. "Honestly, I don't even feel bad. He's so oblivious. Just a provider, Mom says. Not like he's been much else lately." Thomas had quietly retreated before they noticed him, his mind buzzing with disbelief and fury. Now, back in his study, Thomas sat in the heavy silence. His fingers trembled as he reached for the drawer where he had hidden the envelope. It was thick, its contents crinkling faintly as he slid it out and placed it on the desk. He stared at it for what felt like an eternity. A part of him still hoped that what he had overheard was some cruel joke. But he already knew better. He opened the envelope and unfolded the sheets inside. The first page was the cover letter from the testing company, thanking him for his trust and confidentiality. The second page was what mattered. Thomas read the lines over and over, as if they might somehow change. His breath came shallow and fast, a dull ringing in his ears. He had raised Maddie and Miles with every ounce of love he could muster, sacrificing time, energy, and even his own dreams to give them a better life. And now, with a few sterile lines of text, he realized he had been nothing more than a pawn in Eleanor's game. He leaned back in his chair, the paper fluttering from his hands onto the desk. His chest felt tight, his mind a storm of emotions. Anger, betrayal, and humiliation swirled together. But above all, a profound sense of loss engulfed him. The door to the study rattled as Eleanor knocked lightly. Thomas snapped out of his daze, quickly gathering the papers and tucking them back into the envelope. "Thomas," her voice came from the other side. "Dinner's ready. Are you coming?" "Not hungry," he replied, his voice steadier than he expected. There was a pause. "Are you okay? You've been in there for hours." "Just work," he said curtly. "I'll eat later." The hesitation on the other side was palpable, but she eventually walked away. Thomas let out a slow breath, his grip tightening on the edge of the desk. At home, Eleanor was her usual self, smiling as if nothing was amiss. Over dinner, she chatted about Maddie's upcoming recital and Miles's plans for a summer internship. Thomas nodded in all the right places, but barely spoke. "You've been so quiet lately," Eleanor said, tilting her head. "Is everything all right?" "Just work," Thomas replied, cutting his steak. "Big cases coming up?" "Well, don't work too hard," she said with a soft laugh. "We need you around." Thomas looked up from his plate, meeting her gaze. Her smile was warm, but her eyes didn't quite match. He wondered how long she had practiced that expression in the mirror. "I'll keep that in mind," he said evenly. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Thomas returned to his study. He pulled out the envelope again, setting it next to his laptop. This time, he began documenting everything. The DNA test results, copies of financial records, and notes from what he had overheard. Every detail mattered. At one point, he paused, staring at the photo on his desk, a family portrait taken during their trip to the Grand Canyon years ago. Maddie and Miles were much younger, their faces lit up with joy. Eleanor had her arm around Thomas, smiling brightly. It had been one of the happiest days of his life. Thomas picked up the photo, running his thumb along the edge of the frame. He had believed in that moment, in the life they had built together. But now, it felt like a cruel illusion. He placed the photo face down on the desk and returned to his work. The following morning, Thomas left for the office earlier than usual. He kissed Eleanor on the cheek, a gesture that felt foreign but necessary to maintain the facade. "Have a good day," she said, smiling as she sipped her coffee. "You too," Thomas replied, walking out the door. As he drove to work, Thomas felt a strange sense of calm. The storm inside him had settled, replaced by a cold determination. He couldn't change the past, but he could control what came next. For the first time in weeks, he felt in control. And he knew one thing for certain: Eleanor and the kids would never see it coming. Thomas sat in his study, the dim light from his desk lamp casting shadows across the room. The house was quiet, its occupants oblivious to the storm brewing beneath its roof. His fingers drummed against the desk as he stared at his laptop screen, reviewing the final stages of his plan. The betrayal had cut deep, but Thomas was not a man who acted impulsively. Revenge, he believed, was an art. It required precision, patience, and an unwavering resolve. He reached for his phone, dialing Bob, his longtime lawyer. "Bob, it's me," Thomas said, his tone measured. "Thomas, good to hear from you," Bob replied. "How can I help?" "I need you to transfer all my assets to a charity foundation. Everything except the funds in my personal offshore account." There was a pause on the line. "Everything?" Bob asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" "Absolutely," Thomas said without hesitation. Bob sighed. "Thomas, this is a huge move. Once it's done, there's no going back. What about Eleanor and the kids?" Thomas's lips curled into a cold smile. "Don't worry about them. They'll get exactly what they deserve." Bob hesitated again. "All right, I'll need some time to prepare the documents. You'll need to sign in person. I'll come by tomorrow, Thomas said, ending the call. Over the next few weeks, Thomas moved carefully. He began liquidating assets, selling off investments, and transferring funds to his offshore account. The family's sprawling suburban home was sold under the guise of refinancing, with the proceeds quietly funneled into his secure account. Eleanor didn't question it. She rarely paid attention to financial details unless it concerned her personal spending. One evening, while Eleanor laughed with Maddie and Miles in the living room, Thomas was in his study, drafting a new will. This time, there would be no mention of his so-called family. Every last cent would go to charity, ensuring that Eleanor and her lover would be left with nothing but the debts she had so carelessly accumulated. He couldn't help but smirk as he imagined the look on her face when she realized the house, the cars, and their comfortable lifestyle were all gone. Back at home, Thomas maintained the facade of a dutiful husband and father. He joined family dinners, helped Miles with his homework, and listened to Maddie talk about her plans for the summer. But beneath his calm exterior, he was methodically dismantling the life they had built together. One afternoon, Eleanor approached him in the kitchen. "Thomas, I've been meaning to talk to you about the Paris trip," she said, pouring herself a glass of wine. "The kids are so excited. I was thinking we could send them a little early, let them enjoy some time on their own." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "On their own? Isn't that a bit risky?" "Oh, they're responsible," Eleanor said with a wave of her hand. "Besides, they deserve a little independence." Thomas nodded slowly. "If you say so." As she turned away, he added, "By the way, I was thinking of taking a solo trip myself, just for a change of scenery." Eleanor looked surprised but quickly recovered. "That's a great idea. You've been working so hard lately. You deserve a break." Thomas smiled. "Glad you think so." Behind the scenes, Thomas was finalizing his exit strategy. He booked a one-way ticket to a remote tropical destination, ensuring there would be no paper trail to follow. He arranged for his remaining belongings to be shipped to a secure location, leaving nothing behind. One evening, as Eleanor sat on the couch texting, no doubt her lover, Thomas casually mentioned, "I've been thinking about downsizing. The house feels too big now that the kids are almost grown." Eleanor barely looked up. "Downsizing? What do you mean?" "Just something simpler. Less upkeep," Thomas said. "What do you think?" She shrugged. "Whatever you think is best. As long as it's comfortable." Thomas hid his smile. Her indifference was almost laughable. The night before his departure, Thomas stayed up late in his study. He double-checked every detail of his plan, ensuring there were no loose ends. The bank accounts were empty, the house sale finalized, and his will updated. As he packed the last of his belongings into a small suitcase, he felt a strange sense of calm. The life he had known was over, but he wasn't mourning it. Instead, he felt liberated, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The next morning, Thomas left before anyone else was awake. He placed a letter on the kitchen counter addressed to Eleanor, its contents brief and to the point. "By the time you read this, I'll be gone. The house is sold, the accounts are empty, and my will leaves everything to charity. Enjoy the life you've built for yourself. I won't be a part of it anymore." Thomas drove to the airport, his heart pounding with a mix of nerves and exhilaration. As the plane took off, he gazed out the window, watching the city shrink beneath him. For the first time in years, he felt truly free. Back at the house, Eleanor's laughter turned to disbelief as she read the letter. The realization of what Thomas had done hit her like a tidal wave. The kids, too, would soon discover that the man they had mocked and dismissed had outplayed them all. And Thomas? He was already miles away, ready to start a new chapter in a life free of deceit and betrayal. The sunlight streamed through the windows of the now empty house, illuminating the stark absence of everything that once filled it. Eleanor stirred awake in their grand bedroom, but something felt off. She reached out instinctively to Thomas's side of the bed, only to find cold, untouched sheets. "Thomas," she called groggily, sitting up. There was no answer. Eleanor slipped on her robe and padded downstairs. The house was unervingly silent. Her gaze swept over the living room, bare walls, missing furniture, and empty spaces where their life had once been. Panic prickled at the edges of her mind. "Maddie? Miles," she called out. Her kids stumbled downstairs moments later, still in their pajamas. Maddie rubbed her eyes. "What's with all the yelling, Mom? Where's the couch?" Miles glanced around, his brow furrowing. What the hell happened to the house? That's when Eleanor saw it, the note on the kitchen counter. Her breath caught in her throat as she picked it up. "You lied. You betrayed. You're on your own now." Her hands trembled as she read it again, the stark words slicing through her like a blade. "Mom, what is that?" Maddie asked, stepping closer. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Her mind was spinning. She turned to the kids, her voice shaky but sharp. "Check upstairs. See if your things are still there." Miles and Maddie bolted back up the stairs. Moments later, their shouts echoed through the house. "Mom!" Maddie screamed. "All my stuff is gone." "Mine too," Miles yelled from his room. Eleanor stood frozen, clutching the note. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She stumbled to her phone on the kitchen counter and frantically dialed Thomas's number. "We're sorry. The number you've dialed is no longer in service," the automated message chirped. "No," Eleanor whispered, trying the number again. The same message. "Mom, what's going on?" Miles demanded, storming back into the kitchen. "Where's all our stuff? Where's Dad?" Eleanor slammed the phone down, her hands trembling. He's gone. He took everything." Maddie sat down heavily at the empty kitchen table, her face pale. "This has to be a mistake. Dad wouldn't just leave us. He's not like that." Eleanor's jaw clenched as she paced the kitchen. "This isn't a mistake. This is planned." "Planned?" Miles said, his voice rising. "What does that mean, Mom? Why would Dad do this?" Eleanor didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she snatched her own phone and began scrolling through her banking app. Her stomach dropped. Zero. Every account was drained. Her fury boiled over. "That bastard," she spat, slamming the phone onto the counter. "Mom!" Maddie gasped. "What's happening? Why is everything gone?" Eleanor whipped around to face her daughter, her eyes blazing. "He's punishing us. That's what this is. Some twisted punishment." "Punishment for what?" Miles demanded. Eleanor hesitated. She couldn't exactly tell them the truth, that Thomas had discovered everything, that he knew the kids weren't his and had been plotting this revenge right under their noses. For not appreciating him, she lied. "He always thought we didn't value him enough." Maddie scoffed. "Well, maybe if he wasn't such a boring, clueless provider." "Stop," Eleanor snapped, cutting her off. "This isn't helping." Hours passed in a haze of confusion and panic. Eleanor tried calling Thomas's work, only to be told he had taken an indefinite leave of absence. She contacted mutual friends, but no one had seen or heard from him. Miles paced the living room, his frustration bubbling over. "We have nothing. No money, no furniture, no way to even contact him. What are we supposed to do, Mom?" Eleanor glared at him. "We find him," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "He can't just do this to us." Maddie crossed her arms, tears streaming down her face. "And what if we can't? What if he's gone for good?" Eleanor clenched her fists. "Then we figure it out ourselves. But I am not letting him get away with this." The next few days were a blur of desperate attempts to locate Thomas. Eleanor visited banks, only to be told the accounts had been legally closed or transferred. She called lawyers, but without access to funds, her options were limited. Maddie and Miles's frustration turned into resentment. "This is your fault, isn't it?" Miles accused one evening. "You pushed him too far." Eleanor rounded on him, her face contorted with rage. "Don't you dare blame me. I've kept this family together while your father buried himself in work and ignored us." Maddie, sitting on the bare floor where the couch once was, shook her head. "Well, now we're all screwed." "Good job, Mom." Eleanor bit back a retort, her mind racing. She refused to let Thomas have the last laugh. One night, as she sat alone in the empty living room, Eleanor's anger gave way to fear. She realized just how much she had underestimated Thomas. He had always been the steady, dependable one, the man she could manipulate when needed. She had never imagined he had this kind of ruthlessness in him. She picked up the note again, reading the words for the 100th time. "You lied. You betrayed. You're on your own now. Eleanor's mind churned with regret and fury. She had lied, yes, but she never thought it would come to this. The sound of Maddie crying upstairs pierced the silence. For the first time, Eleanor felt powerless. Meanwhile, Thomas was miles away, sipping coffee on the balcony of a modest beachside villa. The ocean stretched out before him, its waves crashing rhythmically against the shore. His phone buzzed with a notification. Another email from his lawyer confirming the finalization of the charity donations. He smiled to himself, feeling lighter than he had in years. The chapter with Eleanor and her deceitful web was closed. He had given them a taste of the emptiness they had made him feel for years. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Thomas leaned back in his chair, savoring the freedom. For the first time in 2 decades, he felt truly at peace. The once grand life Eleanor had curated was now a crumbling facade. Each passing day brought new reminders of the hole Thomas's departure had left in their lives. The debts he had offloaded onto her shoulders loomed like a mountain, impossible to climb. The glamorous future she had envisioned with Greg, the European villa, endless vacations, and freedom from Thomas, was nothing more than a pipe dream. Eleanor sat at the small, rickety kitchen table in the cramped apartment she now shared with Greg. Gone were the high ceilings, expensive furniture, and the spacious kitchen where she used to sip imported coffee. She stared at the stack of unpaid bills in front of her, her fingers trembling as she held a past-due notice. Greg entered the room, his shirt untucked and his expression sour. "What's for dinner?" he asked curtly. Eleanor didn't look up. "There's some leftovers in the fridge," he scoffed. "Leftovers again? God, how the mighty have fallen." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "You think I'm not doing enough? Maybe you could get a real job instead of blaming me for everything." Greg laughed bitterly. "A real job? That's rich coming from the woman who thought she could live off someone else's money forever. Face it, Eleanor, you were nothing without Thomas, and now you're dragging me down with you." She slammed her hands on the table, glaring at him. "Don't you dare act like this is all my fault. You were right there with me, enjoying everything Thomas worked for." Greg leaned against the counter, his sneer widening. "Yeah, I enjoyed it when it was easy. But now, I'm stuck here with you, and it's pathetic." The kids, Maddie and Miles, had distanced themselves from Eleanor almost immediately after Thomas's departure. At first, they had shared her outrage, vowing to track Thomas down and make him pay. But the cracks in Eleanor's lies began to show when their attempts to contact him led nowhere, and her explanations grew thinner by the day. It was Miles who had confronted her first. "Why didn't Dad leave anything for us?" he demanded one afternoon, his arms crossed as he towered over her in the doorway of their apartment. Eleanor, caught off guard, stammered, "He wanted to hurt us. To punish me?" Miles's eyes narrowed. "Punish you? For what, Mom?" She faltered. "For not appreciating him. For—" "Cut the crap," Miles snapped. "We've been trying to figure out what happened, and none of it adds up. What aren't you telling us?" Maddie, standing behind Miles, crossed her arms. "Yeah, Mom? Why would Dad just disappear like that? And why didn't he even leave us a note?" Eleanor's voice rose defensively. "I don't have all the answers. He just snapped." Miles shook his head. "No. He found out, didn't he? About Greg." The color drained from Eleanor's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You lied to him," Miles said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and betrayal. "All these years you lied to him about us. And now we're paying for it." Maddie stepped forward, her eyes glistening with tears. "You said he didn't care about us, but he did. He took care of us. He loved us. And you ruined it." Eleanor tried to reach for her daughter, but Maddie pulled away. "Don't touch me." Without another word, the two of them walked out, slamming the door behind them. The weeks that followed were unbearable. Greg became more hostile, the kids stopped returning her calls, and the creditors closed in. The European villa she had dreamed of with Greg sold long before they could set foot in it, the proceeds swallowed by their debts. One evening, Eleanor and Greg sat in the dimly lit apartment, the tension between them palpable. She was nursing a glass of cheap wine, her once manicured nails now chipped and uneven. Greg leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his expression dark. "So," he said, breaking the silence. What's the plan now, genius? Because I'm not sticking around to watch this ship sink. Eleanor glared at him. You're the one who wanted this. You told me we'd have a life together. Greg smirked. Yeah, when Thomas was footing the bill. You really thought I'd take care of you after this? You're nothing without his money. Her hand tightened around the wine glass, her voice trembling with rage. You're a coward. You were happy to enjoy everything Thomas provided. But the moment things get tough, you want to run? Greg shrugged. Call it self-preservation. Unlike you, I don't live in delusion. Eleanor threw the glass at the wall, the sound of shattering glass punctuating her fury. Get out, she screamed. Get out of my house. Greg laughed, grabbing his jacket. Your house? This dump isn't even worth fighting over. Have fun figuring this out on your own. He slammed the door behind him, leaving Eleanor alone in the suffocating silence. The reality of her situation began to sink in. She had gambled everything, her marriage, her stability, her children, on a dream built on lies. And now, she had nothing. Eleanor tried to contact Thomas, sending emails and leaving messages at his old office. But each attempt was met with silence. She even considered hiring a private investigator, but the cost was more than she could afford. One rainy afternoon, she sat in the empty apartment, staring at a photo of their family from years ago. Thomas stood in the center, his arms around Maddie and Miles, all of them smiling. Eleanor was on the edge of the frame, her smile forced. She realized then that Thomas had been the glue holding them all together, and she had ripped it apart. Months later, Eleanor ran into Maddie by chance at a coffee shop. Her daughter was with a friend, laughing and chatting as though she hadn't a care in the world. When Maddie spotted Eleanor, her smile faded. Maddie, Eleanor said, approaching cautiously. I've been trying to call you. Maddie's expression hardened. Why? So you can lie to me again. Please, Eleanor said, her voice breaking. I know I made mistakes, but I want to fix things. Maddie shook her head. You can't fix this, Mom. You destroyed everything. And for what? Greg? A villa in Europe? You chose all of that over us. Eleanor reached for her, but Maddie stepped back. Don't. I don't trust you anymore. As Maddie walked away, Eleanor felt the weight of her decisions settle on her shoulders. She had lost her family, her lover, and her life of luxury. And the worst part? She had no one to blame but herself. Alone once more, Eleanor finally understood the depth of her mistakes. But understanding came too late. Thomas was gone, the kids were gone, and the life she had taken for granted was nothing more than a memory. The coastal town was nothing like the bustling city Thomas had left behind. Here, the pace was slower, the air salty, and the people unhurried. The small house he rented had a balcony that overlooked the sea, and every morning he would drink his coffee while watching the waves roll in. It wasn't the life he'd envisioned 2 years ago, but it was his life now, and it was peaceful. One crisp morning, Thomas walked into the local cafe, a charming little spot run by an older couple. As he stepped up to the counter, the barista called out, "Be right with you, sir." From behind a stack of plates, a soft voice said, "No rush, Margaret, I got this one." A woman emerged, her auburn hair tied in a loose bun and a warm smile lighting up her face. "What can I get you?" she asked, her tone bright and welcoming. Thomas hesitated. "Just a black coffee, thanks." She nodded and turned to the machine, moving with a calm efficiency that somehow caught his attention. "You're new around here," she said casually, glancing at him as the coffee brewed. "Just moved in a few months ago," Thomas replied. "Needed a change of scenery." She set the coffee on the counter and extended her hand. "Mercy. Welcome to our little town." "Thomas," he said, shaking her hand. Her grip was firm, and her gaze lingered just a moment longer than he expected. Over the weeks, Thomas found himself returning to the cafe more often. Mercy was always there, her easy laughter and genuine curiosity drawing him in. She wasn't flashy or overly polished, but there was a quiet strength about her that intrigued him. One evening, as the cafe was closing, she approached him while he sipped his coffee. "You're not just here for the view, are you?" she asked, leaning on the counter. Thomas smirked. "The coffee's good, too." Mercy chuckled. "I mean it. People don't usually move to this town unless they're running from something or searching for something. Thomas set his mug down, meeting her eyes. Maybe a bit of both. She nodded thoughtfully. Fair enough. Everyone has their reasons. And you? He asked. What brought you here? Mercy hesitated, then gave a small shrug. A messy divorce. Needed to start over. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Same here? The shared confession created a small, unspoken bond between them. As time passed, their conversations grew deeper. Mercy shared how she had caught her ex-husband with a colleague and how the betrayal had left her questioning everything. Thomas, in turn, told her about Eleanor and the years of deceit he had endured. It wasn't just the betrayal, Thomas said one evening as they walked along the beach. It was how much of my life I wasted on someone who never cared. Mercy nodded. I get that. You start questioning yourself, wondering how you missed the signs. But it's not your fault, Thomas. Some people just take. He glanced at her, the sincerity in her voice surprising him. You're different. She smiled softly. So are you. One rainy afternoon, Mercy invited Thomas to her home for dinner. The house was cozy and filled with little touches that reflected her personality. Bookshelves crammed with novels, a knitting project draped over the arm of a chair, and framed photos of her family on the walls. As they ate, Mercy asked, Do you ever think about going back to the life you left behind? Thomas shook his head. There's nothing left for me there. I've made peace with that. Mercy studied him for a moment. And if she ever tried to find you? Thomas's expression darkened. She made her choice. I've made mine. 2 years after Thomas had vanished from his old life, he was walking through the town square when a figure stopped him in his tracks. Eleanor. She was almost unrecognizable. Her once meticulously styled hair hung limp around her face, and her expensive clothes were replaced with worn, ill-fitting garments. Dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights, and there was a desperation in her expression that Thomas hadn't seen before. Thomas, she said, her voice trembling. I need to talk to you. He stood still, his hands in his pockets. What do you want, Eleanor? She stepped closer, her eyes pleading. Please, just hear me out. I've lost everything. Greg left me. The kids barely speak to me. I was wrong. So wrong. Thomas's jaw tightened. I know you were. Tears streamed down her face. I thought I could have it all. I don't know what I thought. But I need you, Thomas. We need you. Please. They're not my kids, Thomas said coldly. And you're not my wife. You never were. Eleanor flinched as though he had slapped her. I made a mistake. A horrible mistake. But can't we? No. He interrupted, his voice firm. I gave you 20 years of my life, Eleanor. 20 years of loyalty, trust, and love. And you threw it all away. There's nothing left to say. Thomas, please, she begged, falling to her knees. I'll do anything. Just give me a chance to make it right. Thomas stared down at her, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, You chose your path, and I chose mine. Without another word, he turned and walked away. He didn't look back. Thomas returned to Mercy that evening, finding her in the garden, tending to her flowers. She looked up as he approached, sensing the weight on his shoulders. Everything okay? She asked gently. He nodded. I ran into Eleanor today. Mercy set down her trowel, brushing dirt off her hands. How did it go? Thomas exhaled, the tension easing as he looked in her steady gaze. It reminded me why I'm here, why I left. Mercy smiled softly and took his hand. And why you stayed? Thomas squeezed her hand. Exactly. Eleanor's life became a relentless cycle of regret. She worked menial jobs to survive, the weight of her choices pressing down on her every day. The kids grew up and moved away, their relationship with her strained and distant. Greg's betrayal had left her bitter, and the memory of Thomas's final words haunted her. Meanwhile, Thomas and Mercy built a life together filled with love, honesty, and mutual respect. The scars of their past became reminders of their resilience, and together, they thrived. Thomas had learned that betrayal could shatter trust, but it couldn't destroy the ability to rebuild. While Eleanor lived in the shadow of her mistakes, Thomas stood in the sunlight of a life well earned.